Hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about 13 different steps you should follow when you're contributing to some open source projects. These are generally the same 13 steps that I follow when I'm contributing to some projects on this YouTube channel. So let's get started. The first step that you need to follow is to search for a project to contribute to. And again, there are tons of YouTube videos out there which tell you how to select a project for your use case. It could be filtering by the language you want to work in, or maybe filtering by the popularity, by the number of stars the project has. There are a number of ways to select a different project, and I'm not going to stress upon the different ways to do that. There are a number of tutorials and resources out there. Just one advice that I'll give you is that try to work on projects that you already have an idea with. For example, you've already worked with that project in the past, and it just gives you an added sense of knowledge of how the users would interact with that piece of software. The next step is reading two different files. The first file is contribution.md and the second file is readme.md. You can read them in any order. I usually like to read the readme file first. The readme usually contains all the information you'll need to understand what that piece of software does, and it's especially useful if you have not worked with that project before. The second file is contribution.md, and the contribution.md is the file that you should work with when you're contributing to that particular project. It usually has a list of different steps you should follow in order to build the project, in order to test your code, and some of the conventions that surround the commit messages and the pull requests, which we'll cover very soon. So this is the step number 2, reading both these files, contribution.md and readme.md. The third step is looking for different issues that you want to work with. And many people think that the most time consuming part of contributing to open source is actually making the change, maybe in documentation or your code base. However, in my personal experience, the most time consuming part is selecting an issue which interests me and is also within my skill set to tackle. And this is especially harder if you're working with large repositories that have hundreds of issues that are open. So one of the tips that I'll give you is filter the issues by different labels. These labels are usually something like good first issues or help wanted, because these labels are designed for first time contributors and they're usually relatively easy to tackle on. However, don't get disheartened if you don't find these tags. You can also look at the other issues. It's just that filtering based on the tags makes your life a bit more easier. The next step is forking the repository. For obvious reasons, you cannot modify the code in the main repository, so you do have to create a copy of it on your GitHub account and modify it over there. So your next step would be forking the repository. Once you're done with that, the next step is going to be cloning. And this is often called as Git clone if you're working with Git and GitHub. What cloning does is that it creates a copy of your remote repository onto your local machine. And that just helps you to work with the code, alter it using whichever editor or IDE you'd like, and get started with the open source contribution. And that leads to our next step, which is working with this project locally. And when you're working with this project, you need to be very mindful of making a new branch. This is a convention that we usually follow when we're contributing to open source projects, and you'll also see me follow in my videos when I'm contributing to different projects. And the reason I feel it's a great thing to do is because the new branch adds a layer of separation between the main branch from which of the main repository and your new branch where you're making the modifications. Say suppose you want to check the difference in behavior from your added code, you can just switch the branches and see the behavior in the untouched branch, which is your main branch, and your modified branch, which is whatever you name it to be. And when you create a new branch, a small piece of advice, make it descriptive, right? Don't just say edit one or patch one. Give it a name that describes the kind of modifications you're making. Maybe patch one adding documentation for so and so, or maybe patch one fixing bug for so and so. A small description always goes a long way. The next thing is creating a new virtual environment. Now, this is highly underrated, but at the same time very important, especially if you're working with multiple different projects, because all of these projects have their own set of dependencies, and sometimes these dependencies clash. So you always want to make sure that you isolate these environments by creating virtual environments so that the dependencies of one project do not conflict with the dependencies of the other project. The next step is the heart of open source contribution, actually making the contribution. This could be just a documentation change or some small change in your code base, or it could be just adding a unit test to test for a certain feature. Whatever the case is, make your changes. Once you make your changes, you should commit your changes. Or should you? Not exactly. You have one more step before committing your changes, and that is to test your changes. Most of the README and the contribution.md files that you see on open source projects will have some instruction to test your changes. Make sure you follow these instructions. Once you're satisfied that your changes are working as expected, you should go ahead and commit it. So your next step is test your changes, and the step following that is make a commit. When you're making the commit, you should also be very mindful of the message you write with the commit. The message in your commit, just like your branch name, should be descriptive. Make sure that it relates and communicates the value of the changes that you have made. Once you're done with adding a descriptive commit, the next step is to push your changes. When you push your changes, these changes are pushed to your remote repository. Now you do want to merge these changes with the main repository. And to do that, we go on to the next step, which is creating a PR or a pull request. The pull request also has certain conventions. Most of the repositories that you will deal with will have a predefined convention for a pull request. Be mindful that you should follow all of these different conventions. Once you have followed all the conventions, once you have added all the description you need to the pull request, the next step is discussing the suggestions by the reviewers or the maintainers. There will be a set of people who are basically reviewers or maintainers of that repository who will look through your code and give you some suggestions and possible alterations to your code or documentation change. Do not be disheartened if you get a lot of different suggestions. That is the very essence of open source. People do want the open code to be a good quality code. You just don't want anything to be pushed to your repository, because for many people, their repositories is like a temple, and in my opinion, everyone's own code should be like a temple to you. So make sure not to get dirty shoes in the temple. In other words, not to get dirty code pushed onto the repository. So be mindful of those changes and be mindful of the suggestions that they give you. Once you have resolved all these different suggestions, then you're at the last and the 13th step of this process, which is merging your PR. And that is the end of your journey. I hope that made sense, and you can look at my other videos on my YouTube channel of how to actually tackle a real repository by following all of these 13 steps. If you have not liked and followed my channel, please do so, and it will be a great help for me. Thank you.